Hello and welcome to this session on new product development. My name is Robin Parsons and I am the current Global E-commerce Supply Director for Reckitt Benckiser Health. I have over 20 years worth of multi-industry and functional supply chain experience. I've been involved with the IGD Horizons program since 2015 and I'm one of the IGD Horizons co-chair. A little bit about my experience in NPD. So I've been responsible for the in-market NPD process for RB from 2015 to 2018. And in previous jobs, notably at GSK, Maxi Nutrition and elsewhere, I've also been involved in new product development and creation. So the purpose of today really is to let you leave this session with a little bit more knowledge of NPD and the things you need to consider from a supply chain perspective. So we will touch a little bit on some of the marketing aspects and some of the sales aspects, but fundamentally this is a supply lens on how we manage the new product development process. First things first, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to Reckitt so you get a feel for the context and the background. Then we'll talk a little bit about the type of NPD and the launch process itself. And then we'll get into the things to consider when launching an NPD. And then at the end of this piece, there's an exercise that you can take into account and do with your team should you feel that way inclined. So very quickly, RB, large business, £12.6 billion worth of revenue in 2018 with 40,000 employees globally. We have a whole host of brands, which we'll come on to in a minute, but NPD is really our lifeblood. It's how any business maintains its competitive advantage, is having products that consumers want and need in the market quicker and faster than perhaps your competitors can do. So a little bit about RB's values and kind of where we want to get to. So we're inspired by a vision of a world where people are healthier and live better. And our purpose is really to make a difference by giving people innovative solutions for healthier lives and happier homes. We talked about before, we've had a whole host of products that we've been involved with and launched, all the way from Mortein back in 1880 to products like Cillit Bang, Vanish, Gaviscon, Calgon, products that you probably are familiar with on a day-to-day basis. We also have Lemsip, as Nurofen. So we have kind of a wide different range of products for different need states. And more recently, we also acquired Nutrigen, the infant nutrition IFCN business back in 2017. So the key thing for us is our culture. And it really is about how do we empower people? How do we create an entrepreneurial environment where people can go away, do things differently, look at new ways of doing things, come up with different ideas, and really empower people, give them the freedom to succeed. And that's really it for RB. So enough about the business. Now let's start thinking about types of NPD in the launch process. And I really want to start by just giving you a little bit of time to think about the three different types of innovation. And it's a very simple model, but it's one that I find works quite well. So just take a minute and pause the presentation if you can to look at each of the different products you've got below and try and work out what kinds of innovation are they? How would you go about classifying them? Okay, so before we really get into the whole NPD process and the key priorities of an NPD launch, it's first important to understand what type of launch are you doing. So there are multiple different types of NPD. There's the new to the world type NPD launch, which is genuine innovation that revolutionizes a market or creates a whole new one. So an example of that might be the iPod or the iPad more recently, or equally the Hoover. Hoover is kind of synonymous as almost a verb for vacuuming the house, but you kind of use the words Hoover and vacuum interchangeably. Next up, products that are new to the company. So perhaps it's been invented somewhere else, but actually it's a new innovation within your company. An example might be McDonald's chicken nuggets. So McDonald's were always known historically for hamburgers. That was really how they built their business. And they brought on board chicken nuggets, which was a different product, completely different to what they had done historically. It was new to the company, but wasn't necessarily new to the marketplace. There were companies like KFC, etc. Then you have what's called extensions. So these are typically range extensions, fragrance extensions, maybe even color extensions if you're thinking about clothing. So the best way of thinking about that is maybe you have an Airwick air freshener and you've got multiple different fragrances, you come up with a new one, or different types of smoothie, different flavors there, types of hair conditioner, shades of lipstick. So you're not really inventing a new product from scratch. It's not really new to the company, but it is a different type of the product that you already have in your portfolio. Then you have repositionings. So this is where actually you've already got an existing product, but after a bit of market research or after a bit of something, you've done a little bit of insight into how it gets used by the consumers, a totally new market's identified. And the best examples of this are aspirin, originally used to treat headaches and kind of pain, but actually more recently been medicated as a heart medicine. So taking to look after the heart and the heart health. Then you also have baking soda, Arm & Hammer, traditionally used for baking, but actually more and more, if you go online, you go on YouTube, you'll find there are all sorts of things for how to use it to clean your drains, your fridges, or your baking trays. Improvements and revisions. So these are changes to existing lines and formulas. Best example I can think of this is probably, for me anyway, has been Special K. They reformulated the product, slightly different taste, slightly different ingredients, or even Fairy Liquid, where they've done repackaging, sizes, size changes, making it a bit more efficient. And then cost reductions. That's the last one. So this is typically ongoing. Most manufacturers have some sort of squeeze or value engineering project where you're constantly looking at the design of a product, the packaging of a product, the formula of a product, or its use state to try and work out, well, how could I make that product for a little bit less, but still provide the same sort of value proposition to the consumer? So as you can see, there's quite a difference in those different types of NPD. And depending on the type of NPD you have, you'll come at it in a different way. Having said that, pretty much all new product development processes go through the same sort of approach and methodology. The first thing is an ideation. So that's really, you come up with an idea for a new product, a change to an existing product, or something you want to do. The next step is really screening that idea. And the first thing is to really figure out, actually, is that something that's even worth doing? So a great example of that would be with the co-founders of Innocent Drinks. The story is pretty apocryphal. They decided that they wanted to launch smoothies and they wanted to do something a bit healthy, but they weren't quite sure whether they really had a business. So the first thing that they did was they went out, they found a festival, and they created 2 rubbish bins, and they put a sign up which said, should we quit our jobs and start this company? And one of the bins was yes, and one of the bins was no. And at the end of the day, they had more of the smoothie bottles in the yes bin than they did in the no bin. So it's a very simple way of just seeing, is this a good idea? Is this something we should continue with doing? Once you've got your idea and you've kind of gone through it and you've worked out that maybe there is something there, the next part of it is really developing the concept and testing it. And that's all about tweaking the product, making sure it's relevant for consumers, making sure that it works, ensuring that if you're saying it's going to do something, that it actually does that piece. Once you've done that, you can then move on to business analysis. And that's really about understanding the business case behind the product. So that involves thinking about, well, how much is it going to cost me to manufacture the product? Where am I going to source the components? How much is it going to cost me to source those components? What do I think people are going to pay for it? Those kinds of things. Then you get into proper product development. So you can come up with a product and you can do your concept development and testing, but actually you've kind of got to figure out, well, what am I going to do with it? So it's really about developing a prototype, putting in some sort of limited production just to see whether it is actually feasible, and really getting a feel for how you can start building that product. The best example I've used that would be somebody like Tesla. They didn't start off overnight with a massive factory building a ton of cars. They started off with a few cars and really trying to understand, well, how best could they engineer those cars so that people would buy them. Once you've got that, you've got something that you can put in the hands of the consumers. They can physically touch it, they can see it. That's when you really get into test marketing. And that's about, again, product refinement, figuring out what the consumer thinks of your product, what's working, what's not working. And equally, you can go back and you can test some of the assumptions you've made in your business analysis. Maybe the consumer's prepared to pay a little bit more if you just made this change, or maybe actually they're not happy with the price. Maybe it's a bit too expensive and your original assumption in the business analysis when you were kind of trying to build the business case for it doesn't work. Once you've done the test marketing and you've refined your products and you've got it to a point where actually you're pretty comfortable with it, then comes commercialization. And this is really about pricing and marketing. How, based on everything that you've done from your test marketing, your products and your offering and your ideation, how are you really going to launch this product into the market? How are people going to find out about it? How are people going to get a view that says, do you know what, this product could be quite useful for me? And then equally, how are you going to price it? Are you going to, what kind of channels are you going to launch through? Are you going to be doing it through an Amazon, for example? Maybe you're going to start off as a mail order business, as the case many of the sports nutrition companies have done, before maybe you start getting into more of the traditional bricks and mortar retail channels. And then once you've done all of that work and maybe you've brought some retail partners on board, you can then start to think about launching it. And launching it is a bit more complex than just putting it onto a website. It's all of the plans and processes and timings behind, well, how do I actually get that product onto the shelf or online and available for consumers to purchase? And then equally, once I've launched it and it's in the market and it's working, reviewing it and seeing how well it is performing. So it's a very, very simplistic approach to a new product development process. Most businesses have a version of this in existence. They might be split into different functional areas. So for instance, in some businesses, there is a global ideation development office that looks at developing global NPDs and global innovations, and then it gets rolled out to the local markets. In other businesses, maybe the local markets come up with a great idea for a different fragrance or flavor of product, and that's done locally. So you can have a blend of different approaches between the different industries, even within companies. The key part of it, from a supply chain perspective, is actually the process of executing that NPD. So what do we mean by executing the NPD? Really, it's about taking it from the I've had a great idea to the post-launch piece, which is saying, well, how am I doing? How am I getting on? Is this really working? So most companies have a variant on this. Some companies don't, but most companies do. And it's really a stages and gates approach to make sure that if you're spending all of this time on launching a product, you're making sure that you're spending that time in a focused way and that you're really getting some value out of it. A lot of great ideas never come through to fruition because they either don't work from a commercial perspective, or maybe technically they're too challenging, or there might be a whole host of other reasons. So it's important that rather than just going straight through and bang, you launch it, you've actually had a really considered and measured approach to the product launch. So if you think about the typical process, 4 stages, we in RB, we'd call it gate 0, an initiation. So this is really where you sit down and you describe, well, what is it that you're doing? And when do you think you're going to have it done by? So you've got some sort of project plan. You want to incorporate what your idea is, that's really your project concept, and what sort of research has been available on the product that you're planning on launching. If you've got those things, that should then give you an insight into the how does it fit within your more strategic portfolio. So if you're an existing business, if you imagine RB tomorrow, do we think we're going to launch a pizza? Yeah, a pizza is a completely new channel, a completely new category to our business, and we're typically used to selling healthcare. How does launching a pizza fit within our strategic portfolio? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So there needs to be a rationale behind it. And once you've done that, you're then into the financial opportunity and the feasibility. You want to keep it nice and generic, because at this stage you're doing an exploratory discussion of what you're trying to do and where you're trying to get to. So there'll be generic timelines. You'll be looking at sourcing possibilities. Maybe I make this inside of my business because I've got a factory that does it. Actually, maybe I could buy it from somewhere, maybe out in the Far East. Maybe I need to bring on board a new partner who's capable of doing the development. So at this stage, it's still quite fluid in terms of what you're doing. But really what you're looking for is an initial approval that just says, yeah, actually, we get it. We understand the concept. We can see that it's really got some sort of legs to it commercially. Marketing and R&D have signed up that, yeah, we're going to spend and invest some time behind figuring out how would we get consumers to buy into this product, and equally the time to actually do the development. You want to make sure you've done some risk assessments around what are the kinds of things that might cause us a problem with this project. And then, particularly in most markets now, there is a compliance piece around a bit of legislation called REACH. I won't talk about reach here, but it's really about kind of like understanding the componentry that goes into your product and how much you're bringing in. So that's gate 0. That's the initiation stage. After that stage, you'll then work through to gate 1, which is where you're starting to commit. So really, this is where you want to get a bit more detail behind your product. You want to have a detailed profit and loss, an understanding of the revenue that you're going to generate off the back of this product and how that's going to grow over time. And the same thing for the costs associated with the product. How much investment are you going to have to put behind it? Are you going to have to do any capital expenditure on new equipment, that kind of a thing? Equally, you also have to look at it from a commercial lens. So what's the story to the trade? How do I convince a Tesco or a Sainsbury's in the UK to take this product on board and list it in their stores? There's also a real thing around 4P. So this is a very marketing and sales type thing, but it's about what's the product, what's the price, where do we place it, how do we promote it? Are you going to have a promotional strategy that's high-low? Are you going to have an everyday low price strategy? Kind of like what markets do you want to play in, and then how do you position your product in those markets? Sizing and pricing is also quite important. So if you're thinking about maybe launching some medicines, are you going to launch a pack that enables you to, a consumer, to have 3, I don't know, if it was tablets, 3 tablets a day over a period of 30 days? That therefore means you're launching a 90 tablet bottle. Or are you going to do something different? And if you're going to do that, maybe there are some consumers who want a smaller packet. So what's the sizing methodology? And then how are you going to differentiate your pricing? And the best way of seeing this is just walk into any supermarket or go online and look at the various differences in pricing between your big bags of finished tablets and perhaps your smaller bags of Finish. Or you could even look at, cornflakes is another great example. You can buy kilo bags of cornflakes. You can buy much smaller packets as well. So how does that work from a sizing and pricing perspective? You also want to understand your media support plan. What are you going to do? Are you going to put TV advertisements in there, radio, web, online? How are you going to make sure that the messaging around your product is really, really visible to consumers? You might also be making some claims about what your product is capable of doing, either on the artwork or through the marketing piece. So at this point, you want to be looking at, well, how can we substantiate those claims? How do we make sure that those claims are genuine and that everybody signs up to them and believes them to be true? And then again, you're back into what are the key project risks? So, if you're sourcing a component, a specific ingredient from one specific supplier, what's the risk of that supplier going bust? And what happens if they go bust? Is there another supplier that could provide you with the same quality ingredient? In terms of the checklist required to progress, really what you're now going to be thinking about is, what are the next steps of things that I need to do to move into launch approval? Now, the examples here I've used kind of specific to RB. Different businesses will have different requirements, but for us, and I think for most businesses, the first thing is being able to set the SKU up in our systems and making sure that we can order that SKU, customers can order that SKU, factories can produce that SKU, the master data associated with that SKU. So, for instance, it's length, height, breadth, weight, number of items on a pallet, number of pallets, kind of thing. All of that data has been set up. And then from an RB perspective, it may be that we have to make some submissions to a regulatory authority because we're making some claims. It's a new product, maybe it's a medicinal product, it needs to be checked. We've done a risk assessment on the product. In our case, there is in the UK, the MHRA, they look at all of the medical licensing for us, so we make sure we've got all of the forms ready for that. Minimum order quantity, that's what MOQ stands for. So how big do we need to order? Most businesses have a minimum requirement for how much you can order and a cost associated with it. The real question is, how much of your forecast does that minimum order quantity cover? Because if you're producing a product that maybe has a shelf life of, let's say it's a year, but your minimum order quantity is 2 years, then you might have a problem if you're not going to grow that product very quickly. Donor SKUs. So in supply chain, we talk a lot about complexity. Some businesses, if you're in the retail space, you might be dealing with hundreds of thousands of SKUs. If you're in a manufacturing space, maybe it's 100 or 1,000, who knows. But having to manage lots of different SKUs drives its own complexity and cost. So typically there is an approach that says if you're going to launch a SKU, you probably want to be discontinuing an existing SKU as well. That's not always the case, particularly not if you're growing a particular brand or segment. Maybe you're doing a range extension. Maybe actually if you were, say, building a sports nutrition brand, you had a vanilla whey protein, maybe you want to add a strawberry whey protein and a chocolate whey protein. So there you're probably not going to delist other SKUs to get it. Actually, these are incremental SKUs, but it's one to look at. And then the final bit is really to check that all of the various different functions within your business have looked at what you're proposing to do and have given their input. And that's super important, because it may well be that you've come up with a really great idea for a product, but actually that product and the design, whilst it might have been designed globally for you, actually doesn't work for a particular retailer. So I know of examples in the past where products have been designed to go on particular shelves, and then when it's come to a particular retailer, that design of the packaging hasn't been able to go on the shelf. And if you hadn't involved the national account manager for that particular business, you theoretically could have launched a product that would have gone to that customer, into their warehouse, got to the store, and then would never have been put on the shelf. So super important you have that multifunctional approval. We talk about OAS, that's an online approval system, and most businesses have something similar. So now you're committed. Yeah, you've gone through it, you've looked at the P&L, everything's signed off and you're ready to go. The next thing is launch approval. And that's really making sure that you've got the launch proposal, you know who you're going to list in, how you're going to get it to work, you've locked down your 4P strategy, your media support plan is all set up and ready to go. All of the financials have been sorted, you've got the final product costs, you know exactly what you're going to be doing, what are the key project risks, again, and then what's changed versus where you were in gate one. So maybe you've had to do something different with the artwork, or maybe the sizing and pricing doesn't work. You really just want to go back through that loop and investigate it, make sure that it all works. Checklist required to progress. Again, for RB, we look at the MHRA and their health and safety executive. That's a regulatory requirement. Making sure that the SKUs have been set up in the local systems. So now we're really getting into the point where we're talking about, can customers order these SKUs? Have we got the forecast built into our systems? Are our supply planning, production planning systems set up? Are they starting production? Have we got the stock being built as we speak? We've done the risk assessment. Our consumer relations team know that we're launching this product and they've been trained up on it. So if there are any consumer questions, how do I use it? Is it safe for this? Is it safe for that? That kind of a thing, you've got it. And then also, and really importantly, is that everybody actually gets to see a real life production sample. And that's super powerful, because up until this point, you might have been talking in theory, you might have been looking at nice PowerPoint presentations and charts and maybe pictures. It really doesn't work until you've actually got the product in your hand and you're looking at it and seeing what does it really look like for the consumer. And at that stage, hopefully you've got the approval, you're then ready to launch the product and away you go. Now at this point, I should mention that we've kind of gone through this as a linear process. It's not always. So sometimes you might get to a gate one and you go through the sizing and pricing, you go through the detailed P&L and you find out that actually it doesn't quite work. So maybe you need to go back a step, maybe you need to go back into initiation, or you're at launch approval ready to launch and you suddenly realise that actually now we've got the final product cost, the P&L doesn't work, which means we can't do what we need to from a sizing and pricing perspective. So again, you might go back a phase, or you might even go back 2 phases. And this is the point with NPD. It's always you're trialing and you're testing, you're doing something new. And with anything new, it's never 100% guaranteed that you'll be successful. So you want to kind of make sure that you're doing your due diligence so that you give that product the best possible chance of launching a market. And you know what? Even if you do launch that product, it may well not work in the marketplace. You just don't know until it's launched. Or equally, it might exceed your wildest expectations. And that's probably one of the other bits I've mentioned to you around launch approval and other bits and pieces about how you manage risk. We typically talk about products either flying or dying. What is the strategy for if this product massively takes off? What is the strategy for if this product actually is going to become a bit of a clanger? What are we going to do differently? How do we know it's performing? Well, you should be running a post-launch review. You want to give yourself enough time for the product to have been in the market for consumers to really understand it and pick it up. But equally, you probably don't want to be reviewing it a year or 2 years down the line. You probably want to be reviewing it fairly close to launch just to understand, is it tracking broadly in line with where we said it would do? Are consumers buying it in line with our forecast? What have we learned? what do we need to do in terms of media, and how are we doing from a 4P KPI perspective. Now, for us, we have a thing called TrackWise. That's really our online system for launching a product. You might have something similar, but basically it's a project plan that says, these are all of the steps that we need to do to launch this product. Right, we want to close that project plan because now it's really a live product and it's in the existing portfolio. We hand it over to the business to run with it properly. And the final piece is just reviewing the risk assessment. I'd always recommend doing that post-launch. Maybe something's changed. How were your original risks assessed? Did any of them come to fruition? Because ultimately what you want to look at in any NPD launch is not just the success of the product, but also the success of the process you went through. What have you learned going through that NPD process about your own supply chain, about your own approach to commercials, that kind of a thing. Okay, so having gone through the types of NPD in the launch process, now let's move on to the things to consider when launching NPD. So first things first, really what you want to think about is, if you think about a store or you think about the design of the product, what are the kinds of things that you want to consider when you're designing an NPD? Because ultimately, you can design a great product, but if you can't sell it off of a shelf or online, you've got a real problem. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to pause the presentation, maybe have a bit of a think for yourself, maybe make your own notes around kind of some of those things. And then when you're ready, just unpause and we can go through a few examples. Okay, so the list you'll see on the screen now, it's not really comprehensive, but it's pretty broad in terms of the different types of things you need to consider when thinking about merchandising or getting a product into a store. And the same is also true for if you're doing it online as well. So you want to be thinking about the case size. Does it need security tagging if it's a high value product? Distribution, how many stores are you going to get it into and how are you going to get it into those stores? Does it need to have shelf ready packaging or be on a tray? How wide is it? Does it stand up? If we put it on a shelf, is it going to fall over, topple over? Are there any elements that can be recycled? Do you stand it on end? Do you do it horizontally, vertically? What's the barcode you're going to have on the unit? How are you going to make sure that the case that surrounds it, if you're putting the product into a case, is sturdy enough to prevent any damage in transit? That kind of thing. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds. Again, you can pause to have a quick look at the different types of things you want to consider. Okay. And then the next thing, and this is really the thing that all of the NPD is based off of really. Ultimately, whenever you're building an NPD, if you've got a great idea, when you're looking at how commercial it is, you're going to have to create a forecast. And in any business, that forecast will exist for that piece of NPD. It might be a financial forecast, it might be a volumetric forecast, but there will be something that says to you, this is how much I think I'm going to sell. And the forecast is super important because what that allows you to then do in the supply chain is to figure out what raw materials you're going to need, how much you're going to be ordering, and therefore if you know how much you're going to be ordering, you're going to get a better view on how much it's going to cost to procure that raw material. Equally, you also probably want to know the throughput rates. How long is it going to take me to manufacture that product? How many weeks worth of stock cover should I hold? What does that mean in terms of pallet holding? What about truck fill? All of these kinds of things. So really what you're looking for is to get a really good forecast. Now, to be clear, the forecast is not going to be accurate. And if you get it 100% accurate, I'd be super impressed. But you do want to come at it from the perspective of what are all of the different factors that are involved in selling this product. And if you've done that, that'll stand you in really good stead for walking through the stages and gates process. So again, just give you a couple of minutes, pause here, and maybe have a bit of a think about what are all of the things to consider when building an NPD forecast. Okay, welcome back. So again, not a list, not a fully comprehensive list, but a lot of things in here to kind of really think about and unpack. So you're going to want to think about the seasonality of the product. It's all well and good like launching a brand new ice cream, but if you're launching it in the winter, chances are it's not going to sell as much as it would do perhaps in the summer season. Media, are you going to support it with a really large media campaign? Is it going to be in specific regions, in which case maybe you need to think about how you're going to launch in those specific regions? what's happening globally. So a great example for us at the moment is coronavirus. It's super relevant right now. But Dettol, we know that Dettol is going to pick up massively as we go into a cold and flu season, as people become more and more, you know, careful about how they clean and how they look after things. And the same with Lemsip and Nurofen. What sort of in-store activity and sampling are you going to do? When's the retailer, if you're launching it in a retailer, going to buy it? So that time's also a factor in your forecast. If you want to be super simplistic, you can think about how many stores you're going to sell it in, and then how many units do you think the consumer is going to buy in that average store? Or you could look at it a different way. You could look at it from the perspective of, well, what's the population of a country, the UK, for example, let's say it's 60 or 70 million, right? Of the proportion of that population, how many people are likely to be consumers, and then how frequently are those consumers likely to buy your products? So there's a lot of different things to include. You'll also note in here that within the forecast, we're including things that traditionally wouldn't drive a forecast. So you want to take into account things like, where is the stock coming from? So the transit lead time, because there are different types of forecast. There's the forecast for what the consumers will buy, but there also needs to be the forecast that feeds all the way through to the factory to give the factory a view of, well, when do you think you're going to be producing? How much do you think you're going to be buying? So you have to start from the consumer and work it all the way back. Now, some businesses have systems that will enable you to do that. Other businesses, you might need to build it from scratch. What you might do is you might say, I'm going to launch this, say, in, I don't know, Asda, for example. I know Asda have X amount of stores. I know the consumers are probably going to order Y amount per week on average. Therefore, the consumer consumption is going to be this. Asda might sit on however many weeks of stock cover it is, and therefore I know that they will then need to reorder at this point. So if they reorder at this point, that's equivalent to this amount of demand, which therefore means I need to sit on this amount of stock, because actually I want to take into account seasonality, variability in demand, errors in the forecast, and that therefore means my factory needs to produce every X number of weeks. And you can start working it back in that way. So clearly there's a lot of things to consider. Always, always, always start with the consumer forecast and then work it backwards. And the key thing is to make sure you document your assumptions, because as you document your assumptions, if anything changes, you can then scenario model, well, what happens if I get more or less distribution than I was expecting? Yeah. What happens if the lead time increases, or actually they decide to order twice per week instead of once per week? And it's really that scenario modeling and planning that you want to think your way through. Okay. One of the key things I really, really would stress to anybody that works in the supply chain space is this thing called the black swan theory. Now, it comes from an article, The Impact of the Highly Improbable, by a guy called Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And if you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend you have a look at it. And really what he says in there is, an event that comes as a surprise has a major effect and is often inappropriately rationalized after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. So back in the past, there used to be a phrase that said something was about as rare to happen as a black swan. And up until Australia was discovered, it was believed that there was no such thing as a black swan. But when they went to Australia, they discovered that there were, and therefore, after the fact, they were able to rationalise that, oh yeah, well, black swans are definitely a possibility and they could happen, but it was only after the fact. And the same is true with impacts on the supply chain and impacts on NPD. And really what I'm talking about here is, most supply chains are built in such a way that there is a level of ability to react to demand volatility or supply volatility. But a 20% swing in supply or a 20% swing in demand, that's not the thing that's going to cause you to become a cropper. The thing that's going to cause you to become a cropper is when there's a 20-fold or 30-fold uplift in demand, or when that factory that you had assumed was going to be there until 2030 all of a sudden burns down overnight. Now, it's difficult to have all of the different contingencies, but you definitely want to be thinking about, when you're doing your NPD, the extreme scenarios, how are you going to manage it? And for those of you that are kind of watching this either in 2020 or you've gone through the COVID scenario, you'll have seen it. And nobody would have ever kind of figured or planned for the sort of pandemic that we've had and the impact that it's had on our supply chains. But after the fact, now it's kind of like, well, we had SARS, back in the early 2000s, so it's we should have seen it. It was pretty likely that something like this was going to happen, and we should probably have had contingency plans in place. So if you get the opportunity, I would definitely recommend reading the article or anything, in fact, by him. He's got some really, really great stuff on variability, volatility, and unexpected things happening. And that's it in terms of the presentation on NPD and the process and how to manage forecasting. If you have any questions or anything like that, contact details will be available. And I know the IGD will also have a method for you to get back in touch or to ask any further questions on the content. If you want, after this, there is a group activity that you can work with either in your teams, within your businesses, or within your teams elsewhere, or with colleagues or friends, which we'll come on to in a minute. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you've got a lot out of this session. Okay, for those of you that have hung around and want to do it and are involved, let's talk a little bit about the group activity. So, first things first, as a group, or even if you're doing this on your own, I'd like you just to pick a product from any of the 4 below. But I'd like you to be honest with yourself and stick with the product that you've got, because it'll make the exercise a little bit more real for you. Okay, so hopefully now you've chosen a product from one of the 4 things. Now what I'd like you to do is to look at the scenarios below for the product that you've picked and work out how you would respond to them. So for Durex, you've just found out that the factory line is broken down and the factory can't produce. For Scholl, which is a foot care product, and again, you can go online and you can look at these products if that helps you. Boots has decided they love the product and they want to list it in 1,000 instead of 200 stores. For Nurofen, Tesco have pulled the listing and no longer want the MPD, so you're probably going to lose a huge chunk of volume from your launch plan. And then for Dettol, marketing have come across a last-minute opportunity of running a TVC against the NPD, so that's a television campaign. Okay, I'll leave you with it there, and let's see how you get on. Thank you.